The philosophy of mind is the central problem in this century. How does our mind come about? How does this 3 or 4 pounds of meat inside our skull create a sense of ideas and feelings? Why do we have this sense of free will? Now, 100 years ago, it was all about knowledge. The central problems in science were accumulating knowledge of our environment, our cosmos, and the inner workings of things that were very small, the physical laws, and verifying this knowledge. But very quickly, we discovered, as we started thinking about this knowledge we were accumulating, we realized that a lot depended on our consciousness and on our perception of how we hold this knowledge and how we theorize about this knowledge, and focus turned on the brain and consciousness. Now, there's been something that's been with us for thousands of years, since Plato. It's the mind-body problem. How does something physical create a mind, a conscious mind? The problem arises in metaphysics and the philosophy of mind. It's because there's something that seems totally different about the qualitative experiences we have, and how does a physical body that they seem to depend on, how does that support these first-person qualitative feelings? There's something that seems mysterious about this, and this is what's created the mind-body problem. It seems like the consciousness and the physics of our brains and the chemistry of our brains are two distinctly different things. And it's, as an area of scientific study, it seems like you need to use the third-person type techniques we've been using to study in science, but we need to examine this first-person type experience that we're having. And that's what makes this seem mysterious. We've had hundreds of years of failure on trying to examine and explain this problem, but I think the argument is productive. And here's where I want to introduce something. I told you my forte was organizing data. Well, I want to look at traditionally how this mind-body problem is examined, and then I'm probably going to, as this video series goes on, reorganize this data, because you'll see there's some problems with how the data is organized when you look at it in the traditional sense. In the philosophy of mind, there's 3 major divisions. There's physicalism, dualism, and idealism. Now, physicalism is the theory that the mind and the brain are made of physical material only. Idealism, it's on my chart for the sake of completeness and symmetry. It's the idea that reality is fundamentally mental, constructed in our minds, and that reality is immaterial. It's not a popular theory, but it has a place in history, and many Eastern religions adhere to this. I listed the 2 extremes so that I could show the place of dualism in this comparison. Dualism is the theory that the mind and the body are 2 distinct substances, and that there's an obvious material brain, but that the mind is something completely other than that, something like a spirit or a soul. Now, there's good arguments for and against all of these points of view, and that kind of shows what a mess we're in trying to develop a good theory of the mind. After hundreds of years of debate, we don't really have a good theory of the mind. Add to that the fact that there's a huge religious tradition. In religion, there's often the idea that a soul or a spirit survives the death of the physical body. And it would seem like the dualist point of view seems to make that more plausible. But that's not totally true. There's a lot of forms of physicalism and idealism that seem to support the view that, certain religions have. And then add to that, there's a huge philosophical tradition, dating all the way back to Plato. There's philosophers who have all different views of this thing. Now, dualism is a set of views about the relationship between the mind and matter, which begins with the claim that mental phenomena are in some respects non-physical. Dualism claims that we have a brain, but that the mind is not part of the physical world. Often, dualism is claimed to disprove physicalism. Now, trivially, this is true since we are having a first-person experience of our consciousness, and since science needs to explain things in the third person or objectively, it seems like these are two distinctly different types of things, and we're going to possibly have to come up with a new way of looking at this. So this creates some very important arguments against physicalism, and hence in favor of some form of dualism. First, the idea that the mental and the physical seem to have quite different properties, and they might be totally irreconcilable with one another. There's the fact that the qualia are left out. Qualia is something that the philosophers use to describe these first-person experiences we're having, how something is red, how something feels rough, the experience we have in our mind when we touch and we taste things. Anyway, every theory of the mind we have up to this point seems to leave out the qualia, or leaves it unexplained in some way. And then, in science, there's the idea of reductionism. Everything has to be reduced to an explanation that's made up of its component parts. And it seems difficult for us to understand how we might be able to reduce consciousness. In fact, it may be resistant to reduction. And that would be a problem in explaining consciousness scientifically. There's two other large arguments which I'm going to are very interesting arguments and lead to a lot of good thoughts. There's the Mary's Room thought experiment, and there's the zombie argument. I have these they're going to be in later videos. Now, physicalism, it's the idea that consciousness is spatially located in the brain. The whole thing is a closed system, and it's causally closed. Physicalism is often used interchangeably with the word materialism. Now, both terms hold that all brain and all mind processes can be explained by reference only to the laws of nature. Reality is merely particles and forces. The huge success of physics and science in explaining a large range of phenomena in terms of only a few basic natural laws, like gravity and electrical forces and mass, has convinced us that the natural explanations should be our first approach to scientific questions. So physicalism is at the root of every scientific theory, and physicalism is the demand that this is also true of the cognitive sciences. There are arguments against dualism, and therefore in favor of physicalism. Number one, no one has ever been able to demonstrate the interface between the brain and the mind. The argument would go like this, okay, smart guy, if you think we have a soul, how does this soul cause my brain to do things and send the nerves signals down my arm? And if I want to raise my arm and my soul says I want to raise my arm, how does it do this? How does the information get into my brain from the soul? Where's this interface? Also, we've got a lot of data on injuries to the brain. We know that if a specific area of the brain is destroyed, we can often discover that that area was responsible for doing something, and now that person who has had that brain injury loses that function. It's hard to understand if there's a soul where this thinking is going on. It's hard to understand how an injury to a specific part of the brain could permanently impair something. What happens to the soul? And through brain science, we've also discovered that our conscious states seem to be correlated with brain states. So brain activity seems to cause this conscious activity. Descartes didn't know this. So if you have a brain, your brain seems to be involved in causing these conscious states. And for that matter, why even have a brain? If you have a soul that's doing the thinking, why is it necessary to have this complex brain? Well, what I tried to do is create a view of the landscape of this whole thing, of the mind-body problem, of the problem of consciousness. This is the traditional view, and like I was saying, I think is busted in some ways, and we're going to have to improve on it and reorganize the data. So I'm going to go on now to look at more closely at some of the individual concepts within the philosophy of mind. I hope this is exciting for you. I love this stuff.